Today, we're looking at lobbying. The title of Professor Carter's presentation is When Beijing Goes to Washington. And we all know that lobbyists work to influence those who make decisions about a whole host of issues. And so today we're going to be looking at China's state and state-owned enterprise efforts at influencing the decisions and the discussion here in the United States. Professor Carter is the perfect person. Professor Baggott Carter is the perfect person to be talking about these things. She's been working on this topic for a number of years. She is a professor of political science and international relations at USC. She's currently in her second fellowship at Stanford. She previously worked with the Center for International Security and Cooperation. Now she's working with the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. With her principal investigator, she runs something at USC called the Lab on Non-Democratic Politics. And you're going to hear something about their work. They've looked at millions, literally millions of articles and a whole host of other materials to look at autocratic states and the efforts that they make in this global international world. From that, they produced a book, Fighting for Citizens' Minds, Autocratic Propaganda in the Information Age. And hopefully that'll be out soon. But today, Professor Baggott Carter is going to be talking about her new book, U.S.-China Relations in the Shadow of Domestic Politics. I'm not sure that's the title you'll end with, but that's where we're at. She's done quite a lot on Chinese diplomacy, but her focus is on domestic politics and how domestic politics, the ups and downs of domestic politics in China and in the United States, has destabilized the relationship. She's published quite a lot on this subject already, including for the Brookings Institution, the Washington Post, and a number of other places, academic journals and the like. Today's presentation is from chapter 5 of that book, and we are so lucky to have Professor Baggott Carter with us. She's joining us from Charleston, South Carolina, and it's your time to speak.
Fantastic, Clay. Thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. I always love the U.S.-China Institute event, so it's really wonderful to be here speaking with you all, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation after the talk as well. So as Clay so kindly mentioned, this presentation is drawn from my second book project, which looks at how domestic relations in the United States and China affect the overall bilateral relationship. The broad scope of the broad sort of message of the book is that although the two states are very effective actually in building trust and cooperation through diplomacy, it's really the domestic sources of tension that endanger the relationship. That's part 2 of the book. And part 3 of the book, which this chapter is drawn from, starts from the premise that both Beijing and Washington know that the domestic politics of the other side are destabilizing, and they take efforts to change the domestic politics of the other side in order to produce more favorable outcomes. In work that I don't have time to present today, I look at how the United States does that through the Voice of America, trying to promote grassroots demands for democracy in China. But what I'm talking about today really focuses on how the CCP tries to work through the American political system through an entirely legal process of lobbying to produce China policy that is more favorable to CCP goals and interests. So the research question that motivates this chapter is what explains CCP lobbying patterns? What are the effects? Can we measure the causal impact of that lobbying in American political outcomes in Congress, and also media coverage, private media outlets, and how they cover China? There are lots of examples, just anecdotally, of really interesting lobbying efforts on the part of the CCP. One of my favorite stories is Wanhua, which is a state-affiliated chemical corporation in China. It has a Texas-based subsidiary that was able to join the American Chemistry Council, now, which is a large and very aggressive PAC that lobbies for the interests of the chemical industry in the U.S. Now, Wanhua is the world's leading manufacturer of refrigerant, so what keeps your fridge fridge and your freezer cool. During the height of the US-China trade war, refrigerants were part of the things, or part of the the long list of items that were going to be hit by major US tariffs against China. Through the ACC, Wanhua's Texas-based subsidiary was able to get that specific chemical exempted from the tariff bill. And so this is a really great case. Just recently in 2018, at the height of US-China trade tensions, you see this episode of lobbying producing a really important outcome for China, despite prevailing tensions. There are many historical examples of this as well. So in 2000, there was a major piece of legislation being considered, which was to grant China permanent normal trade relations, most favored nation trading status. And officially at the time, the CCP spent around $800,000 on lobbying efforts. However, it was able to encourage around 300 US major multinational corporations, Boeing, Caterpillar, et cetera, to lobby on its behalf in Washington. They spent around $8 million doing so. Of course, the CCP was sort of, using the carrot and stick of access to the Chinese market to compel them to do so. So this sort of descends even to sort of the very minor early levels of academia as well. So here's a really interesting anecdote that I had after I finished my PhD. I was invited on a sort of CCP-sponsored trip to sort of see the achievements the CCP had sort of undertaken. And so you can see there are broad different domains of this sort of influence activities going on. So in American politics, the political science discipline, there's really fantastic work on domestic lobbying in the US political system. The takeaway from that large and very well-done literature is that lobbying is incredibly effective and successful. Ha-Young Yo wrote in a recent article that it is the most important group activity that influences government policies. A very well-known group of scholars asked sort of rhetorically, if lobbying is so effective, why do you actually see so little money in US politics? So you see lots of evidence that lobbying really matters domestically. And so what I'm doing in this chapter is to ask, since we know that lobbying is so effective domestically, can you see foreign governments lobby in the same way for very different goals, which normatively one might have different sort of ways of analyzing? Okay, so to examine this question, I collected a lot of data from Foreign Agents Registration Act database. This is part of a broader project at our lab on non-democratic politics at USC. I'm a co-PI with Brett Carter there. We have 20 of USC's finest working for us, sort of on the typical year, and they've been going for, this is actually 3 or 4 years now. They've coded 30 to 40% of all countries, the lobbying that's undertaken in all of China since 2000. So what the FARA database tells you is that because of a law that was passed in 1938, it was passed because at the time there was congressional investigation that Adolf Hitler had hired 2 very well-known PR experts to promote the Nazi cause in the United States, sort of, propagandize for that. This led to a number of congressional investigations, and ultimately the FARA law. What FARA requires is that if you are a US-based lobbyist undertaking political lobbying for a foreign government, you have to disclose everything that you're doing for them on a biannual basis. So in principle, these disclosures should be extremely extensive, right? So every email that's sent, certainly all the money that exchanges hands, all the meetings that you set up, who you're meeting with. So in principle, you really need to be disclosing as a lobbyist everything you're doing on behalf of a foreign government. So just, there are a couple, we can get into a lot of detail about that in Q&A, but I just want to highlight here, there is a distinction between economic lobbying and political lobbying on the foreign level. So if you're a foreign corporation and you're trying to access the US market, you don't have to register under FARA, right? That's just typical, ordinary commercial lobbying. And there are other sort of systems you have to lobby under, but what is distinguished by FARA is that it's about political goals. And that's what it's about. Okay, so for China, the database that I'm working with today has around 10,000 individual lobbying activities undertaken on behalf of the Chinese government and state-affiliated entities in China. So these are emails, meetings, phone calls, and money transacted. So here, I just want to show you some descriptive data. So this is the number of lobbying activities that the CCP has undertaken since the early 2000s. And what you can see the dotted line when Xi Jinping sort of is coming to power. what you can see is that there's a real shift in the type of Chinese lobbying before and after Xi Jinping. So before Xi Jinping, Chinese lobbying looked like lobbying in a lot of other, certainly other autocracies, but many other democracies as well, where it's primarily economic and to some extent political in nature, really about access to the US market, trying to sort of discourage sort of anti-dumping bills, tariffs, protectionism, that sort of thing. Right before Xi Jinping and certainly after Xi Jinping takes power, you see a real pivot to two new areas, right? So media lobbying, that's trying to promote a more favorable image of China in US media, and also cultural lobbying. So that's outreach to think tanks. That's the most important category. But sort of this shift to what I call soft lobbying happened after Xi Jinping. Now, this shift is far more dramatic if you looked at the number of dollars that are spent instead of the number of lobbying activities. What you can see is that Chinese media and cultural lobbying have really grown exponentially over time. And so that's really sort of a major focus of where China is spending its money on the soft lobbying initiatives, which are really trying to portray China in a friendlier, more cooperative light. So who is being lobbied is sort of the next important descriptive question. And here, this is just a simple bar graph. These are the members of Congress and the number of lobbying targets, right? So this is the number of times lobbyists on behalf of the CCP are reaching out to US members of Congress. As someone who grew up in Maine, I was interested to see Susan Collins is number one on that list, which stymied me for a second, but that actually makes sense because she is sort of the swing, the canonical swing Republican, right? Someone who may or may not vote with the Republican Party. The other people you see on this list are typically powerful gatekeepers in Congress. Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Jim Risch. You see Harry Reid, just a number of very important and influential gatekeepers in Congress. You do see sort of lobbying flowing to some of the more important people who are in control of the issues that might impact U.S. foreign policy towards China. So if we actually take a more qualitative approach to this as well. So these disclosure forms are PDFs that get uploaded to this DOJ website, and lobbying firms are sort of writing in these forms what they're doing on behalf of the CCP. I found something really interesting in one of them. So this is BLJ Worldwide, which is a major lobbying firm in DC. They're notorious for undertaking very repressive autocratic clients in their client list. They were responsible, for example, there was this infamous Vogue puff piece on Bashar al-Assad's wife right before the massive human rights crackdown in Syria that sort of portrayed her as, quote, the rose of the desert. So you see a lot of sort of image laundering on behalf of very repressive governments that's conducted by BLJ Worldwide. So interestingly enough, before becoming this sort of starting this lobbying firm, the CEO wrote a national bestseller on the Beatles, sort of a major career change, which is somewhat interesting. But what BLJ disclosed in their lobbying forms was that their explicit goal was to, quote, develop and foster a community of like-minded experts on U.S.-China relations. So this is really trying to shift the needle in policy communities in DC about the way that China is portrayed, shifting it to a more positive and less negative light. Okay, so the next part of this project is to look at political influence, to actually try to measure what this lobbying is changing in US policy. To do that, I turned towards the congress.gov website. This is actually updated 2020 at this point. I gathered all the bills on this website that reference China. So there are roughly 400,000 bills total. This is all the legislation that's considered in Congress since 1973. I focused on those that are about China specifically. And I hand-coded all of those that are about China specifically, whether they are favorable towards CCP interests or hostile towards CCP interests. So this is a list of legislation in Congress that's pro-CCP or anti-CCP. So what I want to do in this research project is to see the impact of that lobbying on the outcome of pro and anti-CCP legislation. So the first approach is something that's straightforward, which is to compare legislators who are similar in all respects, and essentially to see if lobbying, if you have one member of Congress who's lobbied, you want to see if another member of Congress who's similar in every other way except for not having been lobbied, how their track record after that lobbying episode changes on U.S.-China policy. So in sort of statistical methods, this is a method known as matching, right? You're going to take legislators who are as similar in every way you can possibly measure and compare those who are lobbied versus those who are not. And so the way I'm comparing, making sure that they're as similar as possible is to match them based on, their past foreign policy voting records, their domestic policy preferences, how they voted on various bills in the past, their party session age, et cetera. With that sort of matching approach, what I find is that CCP lobbying efforts make legislators much more likely to introduce pro-China legislation, less likely as well to introduce anti-China legislation. Now, we're going to sort of go past this and take a more sophisticated empirical approach in a second, but I just want to do one interesting segue first. One thing that was really obvious from coding these disclosure forms is that disclosure is a major problem, right? So this is what a typical supplemental statement, that's the unit that they're disclosing every 6 months if they're lobbyists. This is what that typically looks like. And it's asking, what activities have you undertaken on behalf of your foreign government client? And it's saying, I'm distributing a newspaper. This might be considered political propaganda. But this disclosure form you see right here is actually, relatively forthcoming in what's disclosed. In the lab, since we were coding China and a number of other countries, Germany, Colombia, Canada, et cetera, it was very obvious that China was disclosing far less than some of those other countries that were perhaps less geopolitically significant to US national security. So as a result, to sort of look at this in a more precise way, we developed a measure of influence activities disclosed per dollar, right? So that's simply the number of words on these contracts divided by financial transfers per contract. So what I'm really doing here is we're taking all of these disclosure forms that you see in front of you, we digitize them, and we used software to count the number of words that are being written by these lobbyists in each of these forms, right? So you basically have a measure of how verbose these lobbyists are being, how forthcoming they're being about what they're doing on behalf of their foreign government clients, and we're dividing that by the number of money that's being spent, right? So we're seeing what the lobbyists are saying, standardized by how much they're being paid by their foreign government client. This is what we found. What we see is that some of the most geopolitically significant countries are disclosing the least, right? So the worst disclosure in our sample is Russia. China is not very far behind, however, Saudi Arabia as well, compared to other autocracies that are quite repressive. You have Equatorial Guinea, you have Rwanda, you have Zimbabwe and Ukraine, or Ukraine is sort of a comparison set as well. You see that some of the most significant countries for US foreign policy are disclosing the least about what they're doing to secure their interests with lobbying in DC. So that's both a problem for public policy, but as a scholar, that's a problem for inference as well. So here I'm just some numbers for you. So Russian agents are disclosing 58% as much as Chinese agents, and so forth. In a regression context, these differences aren't explained by how wealthy a country is, right? How much they might be able to spend on lobbying. They're also not explained by standard measures of how democratic a country is. So this is about something else that's not just easily explained by some of the most commonly looked at variables in political science. So this is a problem for us as scholars, because we don't want to be doing a lot of research based on poor data quality for some of the countries that are most geopolitically important. Luckily, there's one exception to this data quality issue, which is the FEC. Right, so the FEC, you may know, levies very serious fines for campaign finance and violations. Luckily for us, FEC data points appear in FAR as well. So if you're a lobbyist, it's very common that a lobbying firm will maybe have 10 of its lobbyists working for the CCP, and those lobbyists will be making personal donations to different members of Congress, and they're always disclosing those very carefully. The reason is that they're disclosed under FARA. They're also disclosed under FEC. So they need to match. And also the FEC is very serious in prosecuting, which FAR traditionally has not been, although that has changed in the last 2 to 5 years. So the next part of the analysis is that I'm going to try to do something causal, right? So political scientists in the audience know this. For those who are sort of not as familiar, there is this sort of effort to sort of get a causal link to be able to show that lobbying is causing an outcome rather than simply being correlated with an outcome. That's a potential challenge to what I was doing earlier with the matching. because, you know, legislators are different in important ways that aren't measured by every political science data set. Lobbyists who are paid a lot presumably know something about that and might target legislators who are more favorable to the CCP in some ways that are difficult for scholars to measure. So this, what I'm going to do next, gets around some of those challenges. So two political scientists, Justin Grimmer, Lane Powell, wrote a really interesting paper a few years ago on something called committee exile. So committee exile is this unusual thing that happens occasionally in Congress when there's a major change of party. There's an reallocation of committee seats. When there's that reallocation, the most junior members on the committees of the losing party are exiled. They're kicked off their committee seats because whoever the party that won gets to sort of occupy them. So this is something that creates an exogenous change in the influence of those legislators, right? So those junior legislators who are kicked off are no longer influential, right? They're no longer voting on important measures that are before the Foreign Relations Committee or other important committees that might be related to China policy. So I'm going to use something in political science known as an instrumental variables estimator, which is going to let me get a plausibly causal estimate of the effect of campaign contributions by lobbyists who are representing the CCP on the likelihood of those legislators subsequently sponsoring or also voting for bills that are favorable to China. So to give you some sort of background on this, the typical campaign contribution on average in the data set that a lobbyist gives on a personal contribution to a member of Congress is around $1,400. So with that average treatment, right? So what I'm asking here is after that typical contribution that a lobbyist is making on behalf of the Chinese government, do the probability of sponsoring pro-China legislation and the probability of voting for pro-China legislation, do those change subsequently? In doing this, I'm controlling for a number of important covariates, right? So I'm controlling for the foreign policy preferences of those members of Congress, their party, their chamber, their session, their age. More recently in ongoing work, I've also been controlling for other types of lobbying, domestic lobbying, other policy preferences as well. And what I find is that you do see this major effect, right? You see an increase between 35 to 90% of the likelihood of sponsoring pro-China legislation go up after you see these campaign contributions. There's less of an impact on hostile legislation, right? So the likelihood of voting for anti-CCP legislation doesn't decrease. And in the new work I've been doing, you see these results as well in roll call votes. So actually voting for bills, not just in sponsoring for them. So this, broadly speaking, this is an effort to show that these lobbying efforts and campaign contributions as well, there's not simply a correlation here. You do really see sort of a plausibly causal effect of these sorts of lobbying efforts on the passage of bills through Congress. And I'm happy to talk about more about the technical stuff in Q&A if there's interest in that. Okay, so also just quickly, after that legislation gets passed, there's also evidence of really interesting patterns in how lobbyists act after the fact, right? So we see evidence of what we call inducement and punishment regimes. So after a member of Congress sponsors a bill that's favorable to CCP interest, you see that they're more likely, much more likely, around 50% more likely to receive campaign contributions from that lobbyist subsequently. You also see that after a lobbyist or after a member of Congress sponsors a bill that's hostile to CCP interests, they're less likely to receive contributions from lobbyists at the firm representing the CCP. This is something in a cross-national sense in the lab we've been doing with other countries. We see the same effects for Russia as well. So taking stock of these political effects here, what I find is that Chinese lobbying in DC has really major political effects in Congress. However, if you recall from the descriptive data early on, CCP lobbying, by far the most amount of money gets spent on media efforts, right? So political outcomes are important, obviously, but we need to account for what's going on with this media story. So the second half of this talk is going to focus on those media effects and try to answer the question of, does this huge increase in media lobbying we've seen since the early 2000s, does that change how China has been portrayed in US media? Okay, so just as with political outcomes, we can look at who's going on trips. So broadly speaking, CCP's media lobbying covers lots of different areas, right? So you have the very well-known China Watch inserts when, sort of pro-China content is produced and published as advertisements in major US newspapers that looks credible, like news that's published. But there are a lot of other ways of media influence as well. So one that I focus on in this talk is a sponsored trip, right? So this is when the CCP will invite journalists on a trip for a week or two to sort of visit China and to be shown around by CCP members. The goal being to sort of have the CCP be portrayed in a more favorable light. This is very common in sort of in interviews that I've done with journalists about why people go on these. It seems to be the case that, especially in regional outlets across the US, you might have a reporter that's newly assigned to the China beat, and they may not have actually been to China, and of course they want to sort of have that background knowledge, and they think that they'll be able to see through the spin themselves that they might encounter on the trip, and sort of be able to take something of value from the trip without, being able to be shaped in their views about China too much. And we'll sort of test that at the end of this talk. But what you can see here is that the outlets that participate on those trips really run a very broad range, right? You do see major national level outlets, right? You see Washington Post on here. I believe the New York Times is on here. I'm not, yes. You see Time Magazine, you see Newsweek, but you also see a lot of regional outlets as well. That's sort of a large fraction. So the first thing that jumped out coding these sponsored trips is their timing, right? So there are two moments in particular when they're scheduled. The first is in March, right before the annual National People's Congress meeting. This is China's so-called rubber stamp parliament, where you have 3,000 members who sort of are, the CCP is representing this as sort of a democratic exercise. In practice, it's very well known by scholars that this is something that simply legitimates CCP rule and is not truly democratic in any way. Here, this graphic you see here, this in the right-hand side, this is Colin Lineweber, who is a former Chicago local sports journalist who became a Xinhua correspondent. And you often see him around March, sort of being trotted out to sort of sing the praises and explain democracy, as in this video, as is practiced in NPC every March. So you do see this sort of organized effort by the CCP to present this to the international community as something that's truly democratic. And I'm sorry. So you see trips scheduled then. Of course, the goal is to sort of bring journalists to China during the NPC in the hopes that they'll write about how democratic this event is. The second major moment for these sponsored trips is right before the anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre on June 4th. There's this calendar to international news about China. Scholars already know that there's a calendar of protest in China where there are sensitive moments. Of course, Tiananmen is sensitive for protests in China these days, but it's also sensitive because the international community typically writes a lot and commemorates June 4th and the massacre as well. That's, the time that China is getting the worst press typically. And as a result, the CCP will invite journalists right before the Tiananmen anniversary in hopes of tamping down the negative coverage and sort of having something else being the focus of coverage in early June. So timing aside, we want to measure the effects of these sorts of trips. To do so, I'm going to use a tool called dictionary-based semantic analysis, which is from computational social science. And the way that it works is very straightforward. So basically, I recorded all the outlets that went on the trips. And in the outlets that went on trips, I'm going to focus on references to China in their coverage. I'm going to look at the words on either side of China and measure the number of positive words about China and the number of negative words about China. The goal to be sort of measuring the overall tone of discussion about China after participating on a trip. This gives you a measure of positive coverage standardized, which is simply this measure I mentioned of tone about how favorably China is being discussed on a given newspaper on a given day. That is a very sort of simple measure, positive, negative tone of China. Luckily, computational linguists have discovered or written up these much more subtle measures of how a country can be discussed, whether it's passive in world affairs or active, whether it's powerful or whether it's submitting to other countries, whether it's virtuous in its actions or not. So the first finding is that on the most broad level, journalists are right that they can see through any spin that they might encounter on such trips, right? You don't see massively more positive coverage of China after an outlet participates on a trip. So that doesn't happen. I mean, just, in this analysis, I'm looking at the 3 months before and after a trip. I'm comparing outlets that participated on trips to outlets that didn't participate on a given trip, but had at some other point in time. So I'm comparing outlets that aren't sort of ideologically opposed to going on trips. They're of a type, but just different in one particular trip. So although you don't see a major change in positive or negative tone in coverage of China, what you do see are more subtle changes in semantic coverage. So every paragraph or so, you see a one-word change in whether China is being described as less active, less powerful, and less virtuous in its conduct. Less extreme language is being used as well. There are none of these changes in outlets that didn't attend, so you do see these semantic changes. What's even more interesting is that the final method I used is the most inductive to sort of let these texts speak for themselves. And to do that, so there are these algorithms that let you look at semantic distinctiveness, which is exactly what it sounds like. It basically is looking at if you have two articles. So for example, if you had an article about Stanford football, an article about USC football, what are going to be the most distinctive words in each article? It's not going to be football because those are common to both, right? But Stanford football is going to talk about Cardinals and USC football is going to talk about Tommy Trojan, et cetera. So those sorts of distinctive words sort of rise out of this analysis. And what's clear from looking at these articles this way is that before going on a trip, so here we're looking at how coverage pivots in a given outlet that participates on a trip before the trip and after the trip. Before a trip, outlets are likely to cover international politics, right? The sort of tough issues in US-China relations. Here you see Sudan. So that was a reference to sort of the human rights violations that the CCP was supporting by assisting autocracy in Sudan, just international relations more broadly. What's clear after the trip is that you see a pivot towards economic issues, right? So interest rates, global economic relations, slowing economies, et cetera. So this is an important pivot because you do see a pivot away from military competition and human rights issues, which China sort of incurs some of the most negative coverage about, towards international economic issues, right? So how China is integrating into the global economy, issues that can typically be solved rather than some of the more intractable military and human rights competition issues. More broadly, those are consistent with a lot of CCP geopolitical goals that scholars have written a lot about. If any of you are looking for a summer reading, this is a page turner if you're interested in monetary policy. This is Hank Paulson's book, which has a lot of really interesting observations about his time in the administration and also his work on China in particular. And one of the really interesting observations that he made in this book was that right after Lehman Brothers collapsed, Russia essentially invited China to sell U.S. Treasury securities together, right? And sort of to dump them all and sort of wreck the U.S. economy even more. What was very interesting was that China declined, right? It did not want to do so because its interest was in taking the sort of typical global liberal order, changing it around the margins in important ways, such as sovereignty, human rights issues, multipolarity, et cetera. But sort of it was not interested in ending the U.S. role in the world order in the way that Russia really was. So more broadly, these trends that we see in U.S. coverage, private media coverage of China after these sponsored trips are consistent with these broader goals, where you see a pivot away from the serious competition issues and more towards issues that can be worked out. The context, more broadly, so this is drawn from different work on Russia. Brett Carter and I just had an article that's out at Security Studies, and we looked at the effect of Russian propaganda on American citizens. We did so in the context of a survey experiment, in which we administered RT, formerly Russia Today articles, to sort of a representative sample of U.S. citizens, and we saw how it affected their views about domestic politics and foreign policy. The reason I'm telling you about this this is because China produces a lot of similar content, right? So China Daily, the CGTN, a variety of other media outlets that are sponsored by the Chinese government and distributed in the US and in other democracies. And what we found was pretty stunning, right? So to us is that RT decreased US citizens' support for US engagement with the world and the global level order by reasonably sized magnitudes, so around 10 to 20 percentage points. So after consuming Russian government propaganda, US citizens believed that the US was doing too much to solve world problems, should be less active abroad, and should follow its own national interests rather than support interests of US allies. So this broader context is that autocratic propaganda efforts do work. We found that, so one of the things we found in this paper was that it didn't matter if you disclosed that this content was produced by the Russian government or not, that made no difference. So we do know that these sorts of media issues or media efforts are really important. They do shape US citizens' views about the proper conduct of US foreign policy. So in conclusion here, there's a large literature. We already know that lobbying is very impactful in US policy. The addition that this chapter makes is to say that foreign lobbying has similar effects, right? It has major effects on US policy. Normatively, that's something that we might care about insofar as potential adversaries of the United States government are shaping policies towards that country from within through lobbying. This is, of course, an issue that is also very important for First Amendment rights because those, foreign corporations do have rights to sort of have their interests represented in the U.S. U.S. government. So this is not an issue that's easily solved. Media lobbying yields subtle shifts, not obvious shifts, and very subtle ones in how the CCP is portrayed, less active, less threatening, more in an economic light, less so in a military and human rights violations way. And that those media lobbying efforts are timed when negative coverage would be most damaging for the CCP, namely during the March NPC meeting of China's rubber stamp parliament, and also right before the Tiananmen massacre anniversary. Broadly speaking, this has implications for democratic integrity. And the note that I'll close on is that while I do find these like rather substantive or rather sizable effects, the scope for policy influence is actually much larger through something because of the lobbying, the LDA regime. So broadly speaking, there are two regimes for lobbyists to register. If you're advocating for foreign government political interests, you have to register under FARA. But if you can successfully argue that those lobbying efforts are not political nature, you can register under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, LDA. And the restrictions for disclosures under that regime are much, much, much less onerous, right? So you've seen a lot of state-owned enterprises sort of be able to successfully argue that we're not lobbying for political goals and drop into LDA. After that, our ability to sort of measure the impact of what they might be doing politically is much less. There's a really great recent paper on that as well. So in conclusion, that's some of the work that I've been doing on lobbying, and I'm very keen to have Q&A and to have a broader discussion with you all. Thank you for listening.
But I'd like to begin, if I might, by asking, what do the Chinese officials think? What do the party state officials who are authorizing these expenditures, what do they think? Now, we get some indication of this with this switch that takes place. It coincides with Xi Jinping's arrival as the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, a very dramatic shift. Does that mean they concluded that the economic lobbying wasn't working, that political lobbying wasn't working? Let's go and stop working on politicians and start working on perhaps what we're seeing as softer targets, academics, researchers, journalists. What do you think? How do they evaluate this?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and I think I would answer it in two ways. One, sort of one broad way to think about what do CCP officials think about lobbying. I think the first way to think about it is that it's a great, it's a really productive investment, right? So if the average personal contribution of a lobbyist representing the CCP is only $1,400, and you're able to see substantive changes in the likelihood of bill sponsorship and roll call votes, that's really cheap, right? So if you think about, political scientists typically think about policy substitutes, right? So if you're Xi Jinping and you have a goal, which is sort of not to, not have U.S. adopt containment policies, or sort of not to sort of allow the United States to boss around China, you could build aircraft carriers, or you could engage in lobbying in Congress, right? So aircraft carriers are really expensive. Military investment takes years. It requires major budgets. The numbers that we're seeing under FARA, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars, but that's really cheap for a major national government. So I think that that's the first way that they think about lobbying, is that it's a really fantastic investment because it's really not expensive at all. The second way to answer about the sort of pivot from economic to political lobbying, I think a couple of things happened to make that important, right? So the first is that you have increasing tensions in U.S.-China relations after the end of the Bush administration, right? So I think that increasing awareness in the CCP of the importance of doing some sort of damage control with U.S. public opinion of China worsening, members of Congress becoming much more hostile in their rhetoric about China. I think that there is a very clear decision that damage control has to be undertaken, and this is one easy, one obvious way to do it. And I also think that CCP officials look towards the incredible success of Taiwan in lobbying in Congress, right? So Taiwan has an incredibly long history of lobbying in Congress. Chiang Kai-shek and his wife addressed a joint session of Congress. Taiwan employs a lot of lobbyists and is very successful in its efforts. So I think that the CCP looked at that and thought that, of course, it would be difficult to compete because Taiwan is already strongly favored in Congress, but we should adopt the same tactics to secure our foreign policy goals. So I think that those are some of the trends that led to these decisions.
Well, one of the interesting things that comes out of your talk, and I'm looking forward to reading it in the book, is that in some cases it's about damage control. It's about image mitigation. It's trying to keep the worst from happening. And is that, that's not the same as getting what you necessarily all that you might want, getting more favorable treatment, this sort of thing. It's preventing things from getting that much worse. Can you see over time, because this is a wonderful study over a couple of decades, can you see over time that has become more the issue? Or has it always been there, always about the same?
Mm-hmm. So that's a really interesting question. And that's something I'll write down because I haven't looked it out year by year. What I can tell you is that so recently I moved from looking just at bill sponsorships to also looking at roll call voting. And what I find there is that you do see both the positive effect and the negative effect. They both work, right? So China can sort of discourage hostile legislation and encourage positive legislation. Discouraging hostile legislation seems to be more difficult, right? And one thing that's interesting is that when you look at the members of Congress who are targeted, you see some of the CCP doesn't even try, right? So you don't see Ted Cruz being lobbied by the CCP representatives at all. I think that there is sort of a strategic calculus about trying to make positive legislation more likely. And I do think that a lot of the damage mitigation techniques are focused on the media, right? So that's what BLJ was arguing that they were trying to do, is shift the conversation about China to a more cooperative, less hostile place. And then hopefully policy changes in Congress may follow from that. But I do think you see more of a focus on this positive side, more so than the negative side. And I think that also contextualizes the shift towards the media, where there's a realization that things are already quite negative in the state of U.S.-China relations and rhetoric in Congress. So it's better to sort of try to focus on the media and then have media then influence Congress.
That's terrific. Thank you. I'll come back to the lobbyists and I'll come back to the media in just a second, but let's stay there on Capitol Hill. and talk a little bit more about the legislation and that sort of thing. And it's very interesting that you're looking at the actual votes as opposed to co-sponsorship and that sort of thing. Of the roughly, I've forgotten the exact number, of the roughly 2,800 measures, I'm assuming that only a tiny portion of these survived to become law. And by your calculation, about 600 of them were, to use your words, pro-China, and the rest either neutral or negative towards China. So about 3 to 1. About 3 to 1. Do you have some sense of, what actually got through? Because we know that, some of these very high profile things having to do with Hong Kong, having to do with Xinjiang, having to do with, imposing limits on companies, these kinds of things, they have passed with large majorities. It's not been much of a contest. And so I'm curious, of the 2,800 bills, how much of this was for political effect, that you co-sponsored it because it satisfied you, maybe it satisfied your constituents, maybe it satisfied somebody else that matters to you, but you didn't really expect this legislation to go somewhere. Can you say something about what actually gets through?
So that's a great question, and that's something that I'm working on now. I think the preliminary results. So there aren't obviously that many bills that are introduced or sponsored, discussed, committee, et cetera, that actually make it into law. So it is difficult to sort of estimate a statistically significant effect one way or the other, just based on that. That is something I'm continuing to try to work on, updating the data set to more current years. But I think that just having looked at a lot of these, I think that a lot of this is about grandstanding to some effect, right? And I think that the CCP does recognize the rhetoric that takes place in Congress as really influential, right? So it's damaging to CCP interest to have these speeches in the Foreign Relations Committee that are, very anti-China. So I do think that there is an effort to shape that discourse, which is consonant with CCP efforts in international fora, right? So you do see similar efforts in the UN and in other bodies as well. So I think that changing the tenor of the discussion is something the CCP views as valuable, more broadly speaking.
Yeah, and along those same lines, you've done a really careful analysis of when somebody got to go on a trip and how that may have affected her or his reporting. But I'm also curious about the timing with regard to the outreach to these various legislators in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. Have you controlled for that in the sense of the fact that Susan Collins has been contacted more than everybody else? That, again, she's seen as a swing vote on some of these things. But Ed Royce was the longtime head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, a Southern California legislator. And so he would be a natural target. Bob Corker, same thing on the Senate side. But one of the striking things is that Luther Strange, who was appointed to his position and only served in the Senate for a couple of years, he's up there in that top tier. And he doesn't survive even the primary election later, right? And so what can you say about the timing of these contacts and subsequent action?
Yeah, absolutely. So great question again. So I think two things can be said about the timing. So the first is that you do see a lot of these contacts happen right before an important piece of legislation is being considered, right? So when there's, draft legislation about China, or when there's a crisis in U.S.-China relations that is going to lead to sort of congressional speeches, you see a flurry of lobbying efforts right then. So one example is that, so the two most important times for sponsored trips were, as I mentioned, Tiananmen and the NPC meeting. There was the third one was actually Obama's pivot to Asia policy. So when he was announcing that, The CCP didn't like that at all, right? So they thought that that was going to be a containment policy and that the unwelcome U.S. interference in the Pacific. So you did see a lot of trips scheduled at that time as well, and that was sort of to head off this U.S. policy change. So there's a flurry of activity anytime you see new legislation about China, or sort of scheduled legislation about China. So whenever you see Taiwan arms sales coming up, there are always sort of complaints about that diplomatically and also lobbying. But the second answer to your question is that the congressional calendar itself is incredibly bursty. So this is in another chapter of my book, in which, so I mentioned just really quickly in this talk that there are 400,000 pieces of legislation that were considered in Congress since 1970. So I scraped all of those from that website. And then I looked at the calendar of when they're taking place. And what's interesting is that the vast majority of congressional activity takes place right before recesses and holiday weekends, right? So right before members of Congress go home to their home districts or go on recess, there's a huge flurry of activity to get bills passed that are sort of, bottleneck before they leave. So those are the two temporal major sources of variation.
Now, this is terrific information. Thank you so much for sharing it. One last question about about the legislators, about the folks in the House of Representatives and the Senate, is you've come up with the trying to control for, trying to find identical characteristics. And you mentioned that there are other things, of course, that always separate people. And the thing that comes to my mind is just simple location, and that economic interests, priorities are very different from place to place. And I'm curious about regional variation in the efforts to reach these elected officials. And maybe you could say a little bit more on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's one of the things I've been working on most recently in this project. And the way that I've done that is to try to look not just at what makes individual members of Congress different, but what makes their districts different, right? Their districts or their states. And so specifically what I've been doing is to control for economic factors in their homes districts, the obvious ones like unemployment, the median household income. But most importantly, I've been looking at some variables identified by a number of economists about competition with China, right? So how subject a congressional district is to labor competition from China, right? So David Autor at MIT, an economics professor, and a number of colleagues have been doing these fabulous papers that measure that at the congressional district level. So I was able to run my analysis, but include their variables about how much those districts are subject to competition from China, and the results hold up. And so I've been looking at that. Also, let's see, what else is there? So there's a really great database by Adam Bonica at Stanford. It's called DIME. And what it records is like a broader picture of lobbying than foreign lobbying. So I'm able to control for, how subject these legislators are to lobbying in general, right? So some members of Congress might be very fastidious. Others might be very happy to take money from a lot of different interests. And taking that into account sort of provides a broader picture of, who's open to influence of various sorts. And the analysis holds up to including those sorts of variables, but I think it's a very important, it was a next step of looking at economic factors, not just these individual members of Congress.
No, that's terrific. Looking at economic pressure that comes from China being the manufacturer for the world and all of these other considerations, and how that plays out in these districts as well. If we could shift a little bit to the lobbyists. And so, for example, David Carl, has raised a question about, who is the big spender and that sort of thing. But I'd like to back up just a second and ask a little bit more about BLJ, because you highlighted them. And I'm curious where they rank in the constellation of lobbyists hired by Chinese entities, and how they rank more generally. Do the Chinese go to them because they're a bargain? Do they go to them because they're especially effective? I'm just curious. You mentioned, that they have a particular reputation of representing authoritarian governments. But maybe you could say a little bit more about this universe of lobbyists. Are there particular firms that work to attract this business because they have particular expertise? And who do those firms hire to do some of this? So, for example, you mentioned some admiration in Beijing for the success of Taiwan lobbying. One person who is well known for this is Bob Dole, the former senator, former presidential candidate, and he actually worked as a lobbyist for the company that you highlighted, Wanhua. And so I'm just curious, tell us something more about the folks doing this work.
Yeah, I would love to. Great question. I'm going to share my screen again.
Please do.
So two figures to answer those two excellent questions. So one, so David asked which entities, which CCP entities are the main FAR registrants, and here they are in this plot here. So you see a lot of major SOEs, right? So China National Office of Oil. The second one, U.S.-China Trans-Pacific Foundation, that sort of arranges a lot of liaisons and contacts. Of course, the embassy, one might expect. QSAF, China-U.S. Exchange Foundation, that's the one that arranges a lot of the scholarly trips and some journalist exchanges as well. And then you see a number of smaller ones as well. So those are the biggest players. Although sort of underneath these, there are like dozens and dozens or even hundreds of smaller entities, but those are the main players in FARA. The second question, who's doing this lobbying on K Street? Here's the answer here. So the biggest one is Capitol Council. So I spent some time in the FAR archive in DC, and you can see a lot of materials for them for a lot of autocratic clients. So one of my favorite stories about Capitol Council is that they've employed a number of, it's very common for these lobbying firms to employ retired politicians, members of Congress. One example in this case is Charles Boustany, who was a legislator from Louisiana with quite a bit of scandal and notoriety attached to him. He did a lot of important China policy as well in the House. He sort of ended his tenure in Congress, then became a counsel for Capitol Council. And at the same time, he's been quite active in the DC think tank community, writing reports about China, of course, not disclosing his status as a lobbyist in those reports. So I think that's like one of the sort of examples of the sort of, stereotypical swamp of lobbying in DC, where you do have these financial relationships that are present while these people are sort of engaged in discourse and policy reporting. So that's just one anecdote there. And you see a number of these other companies, Squire Patton Boggs, for example, Aiken, those represent a lot of repressive clients as well.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions focusing from the audience, focusing on the media side of your presentation. And one of the striking things there is one of the things I'd like some clarification on. You're talking only about sponsored trips that originate in the United States, or you're including people who may be based in Asia, based in China, that are added to particular media tours?
So the database doesn't actually have that level of detail. It has the outlet that is invited on the trip. The outlets are US-based outlets. So in terms of the individual journalists, so for example, if Time is going on a trip, I do not know from the disclosure forms if they're bringing their journalists from the UK, for example. So that's an unknown. Unfortunately, they also don't have detail on the individual journalists that participate in the trip, so just the outlet level. So what I was, restricted to doing was looking at the outlet and how its coverage changed before and after. I'm unfortunately not able to focus on specific articles by specific reporters, although that would be really interesting as well. Just broadly speaking, I mean, your question makes me think of sort of the comparative angle here, which is that in the U.S., there is the FARA database, right? There are a lot of other democracies in the world that don't maintain similar records, right? And FARA is problematic, right? I mean, if you look at the comparative disclosure rate slide, right, where Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia are not disclosing nearly as much, right? Orders of magnitude is difference from like Ukraine or other less repressive autocracies. That's a major issue. But that said, there are many countries that don't track this at all. So I think there the scope for policy influence or media influence could be even more profound.
And so I can imagine, for example, something where the Chinese, through some organization, bring a number of folks to see something about high-speed rail. We have a question about high-speed rail, or bring a lot of folks to see something about China's food security, food safety, or bring a lot of folks to see something about a new region that's being opened up, and that'll lead to another question, but. So it's hard to know exactly that cause and effect. And is taking a single journalist on a trip enough to change a paper's line or a broadcast outlet's line? Certainly you could see that coverage from that individual might be affected, but how might it affect the editorial board, or how might it affect coverage of somebody who is primarily focused on economic exchange, or some other question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so great question. So I'll answer in two parts. One is to concede the point, right? So not for very long, right? So there's a big literature on media effects in political science, and what it finds is, so typically people in American politics look at the effect of political advertisements, and what the finding is typically that political advertisements, basically any political messaging in the media, has a major short-term effect, but the half-life is like a week, right? So basically, after 2 weeks, you can't detect any. People don't remember those advertisements, and that's exactly why you see these bursts of campaign advertisements in the day right before an election. In our survey experiment, in a different paper on the effect of autocratic propaganda cross-nationally. So this is Brett Carter and I, we had a project where we looked at autocratic propaganda newspapers across the world, and we looked at whether the coverage about the government discouraged protests in the subsequent days, and we found that it did. If you publish pro-government content, you see less protests in the following days, but again, the effect didn't last for very long. It was a week or 3 days or so. So broadly speaking, yes, you're exactly right to point out that we shouldn't expect that one trip is going to have this enduring long-term effect on coverage of China, but I think that's precisely why it's timed at these sensitive points when coverage of China is most important to CCP interests, right? China wanting to be represented as a democratic state and China not wanting the Tiananmen massacre to be covered. And I also think that the reason why I focused on this very specific sliver of CCP media activities was that it can be measured, right? You can say something plausibly causal about the effect of these trips because we can measure them, we can get coverage before and after. That said, there's a much broader ecosystem of CCP media influence activities that is, I would definitely agree, is much more important than these sponsored trips, right? I think they're a small part, they're a measurable part, which is why I focused on it. But if you think about, one very common and important thing are media info sheets, right? So if you think about a regional newspaper, if the local consulate is sending info sheets every day about, this is what's going on in China this week, journalists are likely to sort of take that and reproduce some sort of that content in their coverage of China, right? I mean, journalists are busy, they have deadlines, and people do take these info sheets and use them. So I think there's a broader spectrum that's important, and this is just one measurable part of it. I think I forgot the second part of that, but
no, that's just fine. And I wanted, because as you say, you have data, you can do something with that particular question, whereas the role of think tanks, the role of academics is perhaps less easily mapped documented. Although, of course, many academics write, they'll write op-eds. Many think tanks produce, reams of reports and op-eds and that sort of thing. Some of them more influential in Congress than in others, or with the general public than others. A couple concluding questions, and one is, there's a whole other aspect to this, and that's all of the American actors who have a stake in China. And so you highlighted CNOOC, the China offshore oil company, which wanted to buy, 10 years ago, wanted to buy Unocal here in California. And there was a lot of discussion about this, a lot of things going on. And, of course, Alibaba's aunt wanted to buy MoneyGram and things like that. So we have something about that. But we have American companies, Apple, Boeing, General Motors, Procter and Gamble, a very long list of companies that need, they would argue that they need to be in the China market. Do you see evidence of them working to influence Congress on these measures?
Yes, absolutely. So that is something that I think is very clear from the qualitative record, but is virtually impossible to measure quantitatively, unfortunately. So my intro slide described how during the 2000 battle over permanent normal trade relation status, the CCP got around 300 multinational corporations to lobby on behalf of their interests. I think that happens all the time. It's something that's very difficult it's certainly virtually impossible to prosecute, because it's very difficult to show that that's a quid pro quo relationship. It is also something that's very difficult to document. So in the process of working on the first part of my book, I've spent a decent amount of time in the U.S. presidential libraries looking at the archives of, NSA minutes and whatnot on China. And one thing that's interesting is that you do see on this recurring basis, Boeing will pop up in a memo asking for some sort of policy change towards China. That's not obviously sort of, the obvious economic interest of Boeing. You do, and Alcoa as well, Aluminum Corporation. So you do see these major firms that do sort of crop up in sort of high-level political memos all the time. So I do think that sort of lobbying is even more important. And I think that in the last 2 to 5 years, FAR enforcement has gotten a lot stricter. DOJ has really been working on that. So I think my expectation would be that you would see this this other channel of the CCP trying to get U.S. firms to lobby on its behalf to become even more important, right? Because that's virtually untraceable and almost impossible to prosecute. So I think that's something that, you see FARA activities sort of disappear into LDA, the less onerous regime, and I think you also will see it disappear off into the sort of multinational corporations lobbying on behalf of the CCP.
Yeah, the disclosure and moving into these other realms, makes it more difficult to track these things. Just two questions. We have other questions from the audience, and I'll try to summarize one or two of those. But first, these two questions. And one is the question of voice, because there's, China is a big place, and, state-owned enterprises may or may not have the same priorities as the Communist Party. They are no doubt, guided by the party, but they may not have exactly the same marching orders or the same concerns in a particular situation. And you also have municipal offices and those kinds of things. You have trade groups from China. You have a lot of different actors. And how does that play into this? The notion of diverse influences, or, maybe my premise is wrong. Maybe they are not diverse. Maybe the overall message is, don't be so worried.
hmm Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think that by and large, like the aggregate really is diverse here. So coding these disclosures, most of them are not interesting at all, right? So most of them are, you see a great deal of, some small corporation, or some, there's a lot of provincial lobbying, and smaller units as well. You do see those sorts of efforts, and a lot of that is, trying to foster sister cities or sort of, local trade relations. There are a lot of these like really sort of entrepreneurial localities that are trying to like go out and do this themselves in order to sort of bring economic things back to their area. So you do see a great deal of that. You see a lot of smaller media organizations as well. But that's typically the case in any sort of data analysis. So what's interesting more broadly is that you can, even with all of that going on, discern these trends in political lobbying, because that is where the majority of the money is being spent, right? So you do see these smaller projects or smaller lobbying efforts, but they're typically not as expensive, and they're certainly not represented by the highest profile lobbying firms either. You do see the ones that are most obviously political in nature being represented by, Squire Patton Boggs, Capitol Counsel, et cetera. The firms that are also, placing the Rose of the Desert Vogue editorials, and sort of engaged in this broader successful image laundering efforts, as well.
No, that's terrific. And that leads to my final question. We have people have asked questions about, how the Trump era differed. Did tactics change? Those sorts of things. We have questions about that. We have questions about the Confucius Institutes. We have questions about individual media organizations, and also the fact that how does this play out when China, has been expelling journalists? Of course, the United States has been expelling people who they argue, the United States government argues, have not been playing a journalistic role. That sort of thing. So you've got a lot going on. Your presentation, your discussion has stimulated a lot. Let me ask, though, one last question. And that's, how is this different? Or what is, the big takeaway here? Now, your conclusion highlighted this. And, certainly, involvement in elections by foreign citizens, foreign entities, that's problematic. But working through an American subsidiary, that, can be done. And there are some very interesting issues associated with this. But maybe you can address the question of, is there a difference between, the California, tourism promotion efforts in China and what Shandong province might be doing? Is there a difference with Wanhua wanting an exemption from the trade sanctions and mobilizing not just Bob Dole, but also big American companies like Weyerhaeuser and others to join them, in lobbying the trade representative's office on that sort of thing? Isn't this sort of the system we have?
Yeah, that's a great question to close on, because that's exactly the system we have, right? And so we, in the U.S., this is a really difficult issue, right? So when these cases, if the DOJ brings a case against some Chinese firm that they need to register or they're not disclosing properly, the lawyer on behalf of that firm will typically say, this is a free speech issue. It's my right, my client's right to represent their business interests, which are legitimate, and their political interests, which are legitimate to members of the U.S. government. And that is true. That is like a very important value in the U.S. political system. So this is not something that can easily be untangled at all. We have to weigh that important value against the important normative issue of an autocratic country shaping U.S. policy towards that country through the U.S. congressional process. So I think that the goal of this project is really to bring light to this. This is something that we should have more transparency about. And I think that I think it is really important to ask, is China different at all here? And I think that comparative plot that I showed is a really important starting point, right? We know that at least three countries there, Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia, are disclosing far, far, far less than other countries. So at a very minimum, DOJ should ensure that the same disclosure standards are applied across countries, right? So I think that's an important starting point. But more broadly, I think it's important to have a conversation about, these are important things that won't be worked out in the next 5 or even 10 years, right? This is an issue. I mean, this has been to the Supreme Court on the domestic political side about what is the proper role of corporate money in U.S. politics. I mean, that is something, that continues to be very sensitive. And in this side, what is the proper role of foreign political financed lobbying efforts in the U.S. political system? That's also a very thorny issue. So I think that the first step is really to bring that discussion into the public sphere, and then that's ultimately for lawmakers and voters to decide.
Now, that's a great summation. You highlighted at several points just now and in your presentation the importance of disclosure and the difficulty of getting disclosure if you're understaffed, funded, and then the bigger challenge of if the system is set up to work against disclosure. That system wasn't created to serve Chinese interests. It may serve Chinese interests, but it wasn't created. It was created by, folks who wanted to say less about what they might have been spending money on and, who they might have been trying to reach, when you're talking about this. And of course, the China situation is complicated because of the role of state-owned enterprises as opposed to a private enterprise, but it's not unique. We have state-run enterprises from Europe, from Latin America, from a lot of different places that may be seeking certain benefits. Erin, I have learned so much from your presentation. I'm sure our audience has as well. Do you have any final comments?
No, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to sort of engage with the U.S.-China Institute. Anyway, thanks for everyone for the great comments. It's hard to read all of the questions and talk at the same time. So if I didn't answer your question, I apologize. But thank you very much for having me. This is a real pleasure.
Now, you did a great job covering a lot of ground. So we want to thank Professor Erin Baggott Carter for sharing this research that she's been busy with for years now, bringing it to our attention. We all look forward to the published version of this and a whole lot more that is due to come. But we also want to thank all of you who have given of your time to be a part of this discussion. We look forward to having you back at the next U.S.-China Institute webinar in 1 week's time with Professor Teresa Wright, and in a month's time when we'll be looking at Panda Nation. Folks, thank you all for being with us. We'll see you at china.usc.edu, where you'll be able to share Professor Baggott Carter's presentation with friends and colleagues. Take care, everyone.